This video is made possible by our generous supporters on Patreon. Check out patreon.com/NWR for all the details. Back at the end of September, I put up a preview of the new version of ARK Survival Evolved coming to Switch from Grove Street Games. Long story short, rather than trying to salvage the original port of ARK to the Switch, which had been handled by a different studio, Grove Street Games was brought in to port ARK to Switch all over again. This brand new port released as an update for ARK, completely replacing the previous release. And if you had the digital version, actually managed to shrink your install file slightly. When I posted that initial preview, I had a lot of comments that were doubtful the final release would actually live up to the footage I was showing. Well, now I have the game in hand and can confirm, yes, it really is that good. Comparing this new version of ARK, which is formally version 2.0.0, with the previous version, 1.2.0, is fascinating as they are essentially two ports of the same game to the same system by two different companies 4 years apart, with vastly different results. Grove Street Games has clearly benefited from 4 years of engine updates, a strong understanding of mobile hardware, and evidently plenty of support from their publisher and the resources needed to get it right. So, 4 years after my initial review of ARK Survival Evolved on Nintendo Switch, let's return to the island and see if ARK is finally worth playing on Switch. Normally, when talking about a Switch port, I'd be comparing it to a version from a more powerful platform and discussing what was cut. Here, we have a somewhat odd scenario of comparing it with another version on the same platform, making the comparison a little less straightforward. That being said, there are a few major differences that aren't hard to spot. Firstly, there's a significant boost in resolution. Both versions make use of dynamic resolution, but the 2022 version tends to turn in numbers around 720p, give or take, with handheld mode only dropping slightly. In fact, in many instances, the resolution difference between docked and handheld mode were almost imperceptible. This is in comparison to the original game, which ran the gambit from about 240p handheld to about 360p docked. This is the most important change, in my opinion. I can deal with graphical cutbacks, but image quality was so bad, especially when playing handheld in the 2018 version, that in my original review I referred to the game as borderline unplayable. But the improvements don't stop there. My favorite issue from the 2018 version was tree pop-in. This was bad both docked and handheld, but handheld went from problematic to legitimately hilariously awful. Trees would remain 2D billboards until you were just a few feet away. Meanwhile, the 2022 version trees render in as fully 3D, far into the distance both docked and handheld. This makes a huge difference in heavily forested areas, where 2D canopies could often completely block the player's view. Now, forested areas are easy to navigate, and as a side effect, are also lit more naturally, thanks to light passing through realistic tree foliage rather than a solid blob. Speaking of foliage, grass is also much more dense. While the draw distance isn't incredibly far out, it's effective enough in most cases to give the feeling that you're on a grassy hill, whereas the entire island often felt barren in the 2018 version. Alpha transparencies for foliage in general are also just of a higher resolution and quality. Texture resolution is significantly higher, which has ripple effects on the aforementioned foliage transparencies, as well as shaders for water. Ambient occlusion, which casts shade into corners, is present in both the 2018 and 2022 versions, but is significantly less aggressive in the newer port. The 2018 version casts nearly fully black shadows at the base of every tuft of grass, and made the 2D chunks of trees even more obvious, with dark shadows where multiple 2D planes meet. The 2022 version adjusts this to be more in keeping with how shadows would realistically behave, and as a result blend much more naturally into the environment. Shadows in general have a higher quality and a more well-blended approach in the 2022 version. In the 2018 version, walking into a shaded area, even in the middle of the day, would often require a torch just to see where you were going. In the 2022 version, shade takes ambient lighting into account, and shadows don't cast the world into absolute darkness. Draw distance is also generally improved for very distant geometry. As for frame rate, both versions target 30 frames per second, and the 2022 version generally sits very close to this. It isn't locked, and some frame pacing issues can cause it to feel like it's stuttering slightly, but I do feel it is overall an improvement over the performance of the original port. That being said, of all of the 2018 version's problems, frame rate was one area in which it didn't stumble too badly in most instances. Of course, ARK is a game with plenty of base building, dino taming, and the potential for large multiplayer encounters, so there's a lot of room for variabilities in performance depending on specific scenarios. As of writing, the multiplayer servers are in the process of being transferred from the 2018 version to the 2022 version, so I'm not able to aggressively test all possible scenarios, but having seen multiplayer running in development builds, I'm fairly confident that performance should largely hold up. Finally, I'd be remiss not to mention the remarkable improvement in loading times. The 2018 version of ARK generally took multiple minutes to load. The 2022 version loads in roughly 20 seconds. Now, this isn't to say that the 2022 version is without flaw. I've experienced some issues, such as my skill points coming unassigned upon loading and resulting in my inventory being too heavy until I put some points back into my max carry weight. But issues like these are small and patchable, whereas the issues in the 2018 version hardly felt worthy of addressing, as you couldn't really see where you were going anyway. It's not that the 2022 port is some miracle port, but it does bring ARK on Switch up to the quality we should be able to expect. It turns it into a comparable version of the experience to other platforms for the first time. As the additional DLC maps continue to roll out, this version should actually catch up to other versions of ARK, unlike the original, which was left without any of the updates other platforms received. It also serves as a bit of a redemption story for Grove Street Games, who, while not responsible for the 2018 ARK port, were criticized by many, myself included, for the recent Grand Theft Auto Trilogy Definitive Edition. This version of ARK goes to show that it's often more about publishers giving developers time and resources that they need, rather than a developer themselves being inherently good or bad. Grove Street Games has done excellent work on this new port of ARK for the Switch, and they, along with everyone else involved, deserve credit, both for the development itself and the decision to right this wrong for Switch owners. It feels great to be able to return to ARK on Switch and actually want to play it. This is the sort of redemption story we almost never see for games, and it's absolutely wonderful to experience. Thank you very much for watching, and if you enjoyed this video, consider subscribing to Nintendo World Report TV and checking out NintendoWorldReport.com for a whole lot more. You can join our Discord to chat with us about this or anything else Nintendo related using the link in the description, and stick around for information on our Patreon. If you have any questions about this new version of ARK that I didn't answer in this video, you can hit me up on Twitter using the handle on screen. My name's John Reardon, and I will see you next time. This video was made possible by our generous supporters on Patreon. Did you know that Nintendo World Report is funded directly by fans like you? When you support Nintendo World Report on Patreon, you get immediate access to multiple exclusive podcasts every month, exclusive Discord channels, an early look at select content, and more, all for as little as $1 a month. Check out patreon.com/NWR for all the details.